All right. Hey guys, Zoom has updated themselves, and for the first time, I got a message that said, uh, this meeting is being recorded. I don't know if you heard it, but I heard it. Okay, so we're moving on to some other European countries. Do you remember when we were talking about Christopher Columbus? And so Portugal had gotten a little rich and Spain was jealous and they wanted to get rich too from the colonies over in the Americas. Well, now Portugal and Spain have gotten rich, and so other European countries are jealous and they're like, hey, we want to get rich too. So now we've got England and France and Sweden and the Netherlands, and they all want to get in on a little of that American action. So they start sending colonists over. So now we're going to talk a little bit about, oops, I don't know what's going on with my pen. All right, England and France and the Netherlands and Sweden. Let's see, look at my list here. Yeah, that's it. Okay, let's look at a map just so you guys can know where all those places are. Here's Sweden, and here's France. And let's zoom in a little bit. England's down here. Hopefully you all know by now that all of this is the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, and then here's the Netherlands here. Okay. I don't remember if I said Sweden. Sweden's up here. They all wanted to come over here and get in on some of this American action. So they started sending colonists over. Mostly right now, I'm going to talk about France. Let's go back to the whiteboard. Okay, so in 1534, this guy named Jacques, that's not how you spell Jacques, Jacques Cartier. It's a French name, and French words are never pronounced how you think they're going to be pronounced. This is Jacques, Jacques Cartier. So in 1534, Jacques Cartier began exploring what we call Canada, but they called at the time New France. So they called it New France. Just like the Spanish called this down here New Spain. Remember, this was Brazil after Brazil would, and all this over here was New Spain. Well, the French were calling this up here New France. So Jacques Cartier starts exploring New France. It was a bit difficult because the Native Americans up there were not quite as friendly and welcoming as the ones in the South. And also there were really thick forests. It was a little difficult for Jacques. But anyway, he was exploring the region, and it was very difficult to get settlers because down here, it's super warm. It's a nice climate. It's easy to do farming. It's really, really easy to get people to want to live here. There are beaches. It's beautiful. It's easy to farm. Up here, the further north you get, the colder it gets. It's a harsh climate. It's not easy to live there. So when the French king is like, hey, people, why don't you go live up here in New France? The people are like, no, I'm perfectly happy and comfy here in France. Why would I go live there? So it was kind of not easy going with getting people to go settle their new colony. Like for Spain, people were easily going over and just taking land from these people that lived here. I gave you an entire lecture on going and taking land from people. But up here, even though they had the same opportunities to just take land, they weren't doing it because nobody wanted it. They didn't want the land. But they did find that it was fairly easy to get people to go up there and trap. What does that mean? Not trap music, not that kind of trap, but trap animals for their fur. Because at that time, fur coats were awesome. Everybody wanted a nice fur coat. So go and trap animals for their fur. So trapping and fishing were really popular. So you could get people to go to stay there to trap and to fur. Trap and fur, trap and fish. Those were really popular. Then in the 1600s, the King of France, who was, Louis the 14th at the time, sent settlers, lots and lots of people. He sent them. That means they didn't have a choice. He said he would pick people like you, and you. I'm sending you to go live in New France. You're going there. So he would just pick people and say, you're going to go live in New France now. And why he did that was because England was actually doing really, really well with their colonies in what they were calling New England. Let me show you. So all through here and here was New France. But along here, along the coast, along the Atlantic coast, was English colonies. And the English colonies were doing really well. And so France was jealous of Britain. And so the King of France took a bunch of people and sent them and made them live there. Okay, so once again, along the coast was English colonies, and they started doing really well. They were prospering and doing great. And so the King of France was jealous. And so he sent colonists and made them live in New France, which was Canada and this inside part of what we now call the United States. So it wasn't called Canada. It was not called the United States. They were calling this at the time New France and New England. And this down here was New Spain. New France, New England, New Spain. All right. Okay, so that's it for, all right. So by the 1700s, France had control of almost all of what we call now Canada and almost half of what we call the United States. All the way down to here, Louisiana, right here, all the way down from what now is Canada, all the way down to Louisiana. That's a big chunk. Because, I mean, in Europe, this is all of France. But over here, they had all of this, and here, a whole bunch of this, and all the way down to here. It's a huge chunk of land. Okay, now we're going to switch over to England. The English started their first colony in the US. Sorry, I said US. It was not the United States. They were calling it New England. In the year 1607. And they called it Jamestown. And it was in a place that we now call Virginia. Let me show you where it was. Jamestown, Virginia. Right here, this red pin, right there. Here's Virginia, the pin. Here's New York, Florida, Jamestown, right there. So over here, this is England. Ship came straight over to Jamestown. Now, due to them not having any idea what they were doing and the climate being completely different, everything was different. They had no idea what they were doing. So they couldn't grow food. Starvation and disease, almost all of them died. 80% died. That's really like almost all of them. If there were 100 colonists, only 20 of them lived. That's really almost all of them died. And the story goes that the few of them that lived, they lived because the Native Americans were kind to them and helped them survive. And that was in 1607. In 1620, another colony was started, and that colony was called Plymouth, and it's in a state now called Massachusetts. That is a very strange name. If you think it's a strange name, don't worry about it. Even Americans think it's a strange name. Massachusetts. 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 I'll show you where that is. Plymouth, Massachusetts. It's way up north. There's Plymouth, Massachusetts. I spelled it wrong on our whiteboard. It's got a U in it. Plymouth, Massachusetts is way up here. And Plymouth, Massachusetts, it's got a U there. Plymouth, Massachusetts was founded by Pilgrims. These were a special type of Protestants that were, remember what Protestants are, they were protesting the Catholic Church. But these were some fierce protesters, and they were protesting so seriously that no one in Europe liked them, and they were so seriously protesting that they left Europe. They were so fiercely, adamantly different that they went all the way across the ocean so they could practice their version of Christianity and be away from the other people. They went all the way across the ocean to get away from the other people. And then they were seeking religious freedoms. They wanted to practice Christianity the way they wanted to practice Christianity. And they went all the way across the ocean to do it. And then some other Christians, some other Protestants showed up that also wanted to practice Christianity in the way that they wanted to practice Christianity. And they all started the Massachusetts Bay Colony that eventually became the state of Massachusetts. All right. So these eventually, there were 13 colonies, and they kind of started for different reasons. And they started up during the 1600s and the 1700s. A couple of them, like Virginia and New York. Virginia and New York were purely about money. The only reason that these colonies even existed, the colonies of Virginia and New York existed for profit. Now, and Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, these three colonies were havens for religious groups. What that means is they were, some religious group was in Europe, and people in Europe did not like them. They were getting persecuted in Europe, and they fled Europe and went to the Americas so they could practice whatever their religious beliefs were, and they wound up in either Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, or Maryland. And then there were places like Georgia and South Carolina. Oops, not South Carolina. South Carolina. In Georgia and South Carolina, these two colonies were both gifts. The entire colony was a gift from the king to Loyalist to the king. So what is a Loyalist? A loyalist is someone that stays faithful to the king. Like, let me show you the map. Okay, so England is way over here. The colonies are way over here. And there's a big old ocean in between. You know, when there's a big old ocean in between and people over here start talking about independence, and some people over here might start saying, I don't want to be independent. I still want to be loyal to my king. I still respect my king. I'm still a British citizen. I just happen to live over here. I'm still going to do what the king says. I'm still British. I just happen to live over here. But other people are saying, no, 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 no. I want to be independent. Let's have a revolution. I'm an American. But then there's still the people that are saying, no, 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 no. I'm a loyalist. I am loyal to my king. Well, that person that is still loyal to the king, as a gift, the king might give him a gift for being loyal to him. Well, the king actually gave an entire colony to that person. And Georgia, here, Georgia, that's where I'm from. It's a state now because the United States is an independent country now. But this entire state of Georgia, it was a colony. This entire colony of Georgia was a gift from the king to a loyalist. And South Carolina here, this entire colony was a gift from the king to someone that was loyal to him. So Georgia, South Carolina, here's Pennsylvania I was talking about, here's New York, Massachusetts is here. These were all part of the original 13 colonies that were settled by England. And these up here in the northeast, see if here's the United States. If we were to break it up, this would be the northwest, southwest, northeast, southeast. The 13 colonies in the northeast, this part, is what they called New England. And let's see here. Yes. Okay. So I don't have to write this part down. I can just tell you. In the beginning of the settling of New France and New England, the colonists thought they were going to get really rich, just like the settlers of New Spain did. But they quickly realized that was not going to happen. And it was a struggle. Because remember, I'm sure you remember, it was just a lecture ago, that down here, they were getting super rich. Silver and gold. And remember, Spain became the richest country in all of Europe. They had spices coming from the Spice Islands, and they had silver and gold coming from here. But up here in North America, the colonists weren't getting any of that. Life was a struggle. But eventually, they found a way. They found a way. Some of them found a way to make money. They found a way to live, and some of them found a way to get rich. So what they did was, up here in New France, they had their fishing and trapping for furs. And then up here, where they call New England, we had fishing, timber. I'll write this down for you so you don't forget. In the New England colonies, they had fishing, timber, and shipbuilding. Just in case you don't know what timber is, this is trees, growing trees. That's not New England. New England. Timber, now lots of times when we think of timber, it's for paper. But at that time, timber was mostly for building, like houses and things. And then in the middle states, not states, colonies, in the middle, it was mostly farming, usually grain. And then in the South, they would do cash crops. They do rice and tobacco. And then they learned pretty quickly about slaves, the value of slaves. Sorry that I used that term, the value of slaves, but in 2021, we know that that's a horrible thing. But if we're talking about the 1600s and 1700s, if we're taking ourselves back to that time, they thought of it as, hey, wow, I can just buy a slave and then it's a great value to me. So it was a great value to them. And I know that when we think about class, when we think about world history class, lots of times when we think about slavery and the slave trade, we always think about this part of the United States, but really far more slaves were brought below this line. Far, far, far more slaves were brought from Africa to Latin America and South America than were ever brought to North America. So what happened was Europeans that were living up here saw how the slaves were being used down here and saw how rich the European farmers were getting down here. And we're like, whoa, look at how much money they're making down here by using those slaves. Let's do it up here. And so that's why they started using them up here. So up here, it was shipbuilding, timber, and what else did I say? Fishing? Yeah. And then here in the middle, it was farming, and then farming grain. And then down here, sorry, I keep hitting that. And then down here, it was rice and tobacco. And then they used slaves all throughout the colonies, but they used a lot more of them in the South. Okay, yes, now, war, there was a war. All right, by the late 1600s, when I say late 1600s, I mean after the 1650s, England and France were bickering and fighting over who was going to control. Actually, there was a little bit more to it than that. So let me let's see here. Okay, so the French. Let me go back to the map. All right, late 1600s. The French claimed almost all of this. Once again, I cannot stress enough that before the Europeans came over here, there were already people living here. There were already people there. But the Europeans showed up and just claimed it as their own. They're like, oh, I live here now, it's mine. Okay, so late 1600s, now the French are here and they claim all of this as their own. And they claim most of the middle part of what we call the United States as their own. England claims most of the east coast of the United States, what we call the United States, as their own. Spain has moved up and now claims what we call Texas and Florida as their own. And also the Dutch, that's the Netherlands, they've moved in here and they've claimed little bits of this in here. They've claimed little parts of it as their own. And the Native Americans still are living in here, and they have different tribes, different native tribes have picked different sides that they agree with. Like some native tribes have sided with the British, and some native tribes have sided with the French, and some native tribes have sided with the Dutch, and some native tribes have sided with the Spanish, and you never know really which natives are sided with who, and that's just how it's going. But the main two European sides, if we're thinking of them as like a sporting event, are the French and the British, because they're the two that have the largest areas that they've claimed as their own. And they are now fighting, not physically, they're not physically fighting yet, but they're arguing with each other over territory. Then, in the year 1754, an actual war broke out. And it's called, it was a war between the French and the British. But it's called the French and Indian War. Why is that? It is not called the French and Indian War just to confuse you. That is not why it's called the French and Indian War. It's called the French and Indian War because the French and Indians, some Indians, joined together to fight against the British. Hope you understand. The French and the Indians joined together to fight against the British. So it's called the French and Indian War. But then it gets even more complicated. But it doesn't have to be complicated. Just follow along. In 1763, this exact war, the same war, spread to Europe. Then fighting broke out in India. Then fighting broke out in Africa. And it's all this same war. They're fighting about the exact same thing. And then they called it the 7 Years' War. So, the French and Indian War, and the 7 Years' War are the exact same war. They're fighting about the same thing. It's just when we're talking about them, it's like a world war. That's really what it is. Except it's France and England. And it's French troops fighting British troops. You know, you already know all this. We've talked about this before. So France has colonies in Ghana. And England has colonies in Ghana. And France has colonies here in Togo. So they were fighting each other. And they were fighting each other over land over here. And when they were fighting each other here over their colonies over here, they called this the 7 Years' War. But when they were actually physically fighting here, they called it the French and Indian War. But it was all the same dang war, fighting about the same dang thing. And this is something that really, really confuses a lot of people. I know it confused me when I was your age, but I know I'm doing a much better job of explaining this to you than my high school world history teacher did. Because my high school world history teacher just kind of glossed over this and didn't really explain to me what was going on. So it's just think of it as one war being spread all over the world. And when the fighting was physically happening on the soil of the Americas, we call it the French and Indian War. If the soldiers were standing in Africa or standing in Europe or standing in India, we call it the 7 Years' War. But they were fighting the same war over the same issue, and the issue was property in the Americas. And it was France fighting Britain over who gets to rule this land. That's what they were fighting over. It was France fighting Britain over who gets to fight this land. And if the soldiers were standing in the Americas, it's called the French and Indian War. If the soldiers were standing in Europe, India, or Africa, It's called the 7 Years' War. And you will hear about this war again in other history classes in your life. And sometimes people will talk about it as a 7 Years' War. Sometimes people will talk about it as the French and Indian War. But if you can learn right now that it's the same war and they're fighting about the same thing, if you can get that in your head, it will help you in the future. Okay, and how did it turn out? Well, it turned out Britain won. France lost. They had to give up their property, and they are still angry about it today. There are still very, very strong French holdouts up here in Canada. There are still really strong areas of Canada where they insist on speaking French and having their French heritage. And still here in Louisiana, there are still really, really strong French holdouts where they still consider themselves descendants of the, I mean, they don't just consider themselves, they are descendants of the French, but they have kind of funny accents and their French is odd. Okay. And it ended with the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763. Okay, now we talk just a little bit about the slave trade, because I'm going to show you a documentary about the slave trade. So I'm not going to give you a huge lecture about it, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit. I'm not going to draw it because I have, all right, we've got this thing called triangular trade. This is the, triangular trade. It's a term about the slave trade. So ships would leave England or wherever they were in Europe. It was a ship, so clearly it did not go straight through the land. It had to go around through the ocean. I just drew my, because I'm trying to make it look like a triangle. And so they took from Europe on their ships, they took guns, cloth, and cash to Africa. And they would trade guns, cloth, and cash for human beings. And then they would load up their ships with human beings, and they would take their slaves over to the Americas, and they would trade human beings for cotton, fur, fish, rum, and sugar. Drop the slaves off here in the Americas, and then they would take their cotton, fur, fish, rum, and sugar over to Europe. And they would make this triangle, and they would go around and 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 around like this. This is called triangular trade. And tradesmen would get rich. I can write on this. Rich, 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 rich on this triangular trade. Now, every once in a while, they might lose a ship. And sure, that would suck. They might lose an entire ship full of slaves. But they really didn't care. They were so rich. They didn't care that they lost a ship full of people. Number one, they didn't really think of them as people. They just thought of them as animals. So what that they lost a ship full of animals? They didn't care. Even if they lost a ship full of guns and cloth and cash, they were getting so rich. They would just get another ship full of guns, cloth, and cash because they just had another one to go. They were getting crazy rich off this. There was always another ship to go around. Like, the only time that it would really be bad was maybe if it happened to be that someone lost their very first ship. But, you know, I mean, what are the odds on that? That's probably not going to happen. So every once in a while, somebody might lose a ship, but they were making so much money. These guys were getting crazy rich off the slave trade. So, triangular trade. This is an important word to learn. Okay, we're finished today. I will see you soon.